She had stood beside him at every event for 3 years. She had worn his family's colors, smiled when the cameras found them, and never once flinched when his rivals stared. And then, in front of every person who mattered in Osaka's business world, she looked Kenji Mori directly in the eyes, the man everyone called his enemy, and she chose him. Nobody in that ballroom could believe what they were watching. Not the investors, not the council of old families, not the journalists who had been invited to cover what was supposed to be a night of quiet celebration. And certainly not Ryota Shindo, who stood at the far end of the long marble table with a glass of whiskey in his hand and the particular stillness of a man who has just been handed a grenade. She chose his enemy, in public, with witnesses. And what came next destroyed everything everyone thought they knew, including her. Welcome to a story about loyalty, deception, and the kind of truth that doesn't arrive quietly. It walks into the room and forces everyone to stand. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and stay with us, because this story is only going to get more complicated from here. Her name was Elena Vasquez, 29 years old. With light brown hair she always kept pulled back during working hours and let fall loose only when she thought no one important was watching. She was a forensic risk analyst for a private consulting firm contracted by Shindo Industries, and she was exceptionally good at her job in the specific way that quietly brilliant people are. Not by announcing herself, but by being the person in the room whose absence would collapse the entire structure. She had first entered Ryota Shindo's professional orbit through a contract her firm had taken 2 years before the story truly begins. A series of financial irregularities in one of his subsidiary companies had required an external review, and Elena had been assigned lead analyst. She had delivered her report in 48 minutes flat during a meeting that was supposed to last 2 hours. She had identified 3 separate exposure points his internal team had missed entirely, and she had done it without condescension, without theater, and without asking for acknowledgement. She simply presented the findings, answered questions with precision, and left. Ryota had watched her from across the boardroom table and said nothing at the time. But the next morning, his chief of operations received a request to extend the consulting contract indefinitely. That was how it began. Not with romance, not with a dramatic moment, not with anything that looked like the beginning of something significant. It began with competence recognized and quietly retained. Over the following months, Elena moved deeper into the operations of Shindo Industries in the specific capacity of external risk advisory. She was not an employee. She was not a partner. She was a contractor with a clearance level that exceeded what most internal managers were granted because Ryota had personally authorized it and because she had earned it methodically, deliverable by deliverable, each one sharper than the last. They worked closely. Late evenings when a crisis required it. Early mornings before the Tokyo flights. Side by side in rooms where the decisions being made moved markets and no one outside those walls would ever know. And slowly, carefully, in the way that proximity between 2 disciplined people sometimes produces something neither of them planned, they became something more than professional. They did not speak about it directly. That was not how either of them operated. But there were small things. The way he poured her tea without asking, knowing she didn't take sugar. The way she would leave a single annotated page on his desk the morning after a difficult meeting, not a full report, just the one number he had been thinking about, but hadn't said aloud. The way silence between them had become a language with its own syntax. By the time the annual Shindo Industries Coalition dinner arrived, a formal gathering of allied business families, institutional investors, and the old industrial council that still held quiet influence over Osaka's commercial corridors, Elena had been at Ryota's side in a professional capacity for nearly 3 years. She was known, she was respected, she was trusted, and she was hiding something that would change everything. Now, before we go further, if you're feeling that pull already, that need to know what she was hiding, you're exactly where this story wants you. Drop a like on this video right now. It tells us you're here. It tells us this is worth continuing. And trust me, you want to continue. Kenji Mori was not simply a rival. The word rival implies a symmetry that didn't exist between him and Ryota Shindo. They had once been part of the same world. Not friends, but collaborators within a shared structure that had, in the language of men like them, certain unspoken rules. Rules about territory, about information, about the kind of promises that are made without paper and kept without witnesses. Something had broken between them 7 years before the night of the coalition dinner. No one outside a very small circle knew exactly what. What the wider business community knew was this. Kenji Mori now controlled 3 port logistics operations that Shindo Industries considered essential to its expansion into the northern supply chain, and he held them in a way that made partnership impossible and conflict constant. He was not crude about it. He did not issue threats. He simply occupied the space that Ryota needed and made sure that occupying it cost him. Mori was 44 years old, lean in the way that men who have known real scarcity stay lean even after prosperity arrives. He had silver at his temples and dark eyes that had the quality of a room with no windows. There was no reading the light in them. He dressed well, spoke carefully, and had the particular social gift of making people feel that he had been waiting specifically to speak to them. It was not warmth, it was precision deployed in the shape of warmth, which is a more powerful thing. Eleanor had met him exactly once before the night of the dinner, a corridor encounter at an industry conference in Kyoto, 14 months earlier. They had exchanged fewer than 6 sentences. She had given him nothing. He had given her something she had not expected, a very small nod, almost imperceptible, as if acknowledging something between them that had not yet been spoken. She had thought about that nod for 14 months. The coalition dinner was held at the Hana Pavilion, a venue on the eastern edge of Osaka's business district that had been used for these gatherings for 30 years. It was a building that understood ceremony, high ceilings, understated lighting, the kind of acoustics that absorbed conversation without killing it. Round tables arranged in a constellation around a central space used for presentations and occasionally announcements. Eleanor arrived with Ryota's delegation. She wore a deep navy dress with clean lines and no embellishment. She had learned that in rooms like this one, decoration was a form of distraction, and she never wanted to be the person people looked at instead of listened to. Her hair was down. She had decided that deliberately. The forensic part of her brain had filed that decision under something she could not yet name. The evening began in the way these evenings always began. Drinks, introductions that were really assessments, conversations that operated on 2 levels simultaneously, the surface one perfectly pleasant and the subterranean one entirely about leverage. Elena was fluid in this environment. She had learned to exist in the gap between what was being said and what was being communicated, and she used that gap the way a surgeon uses the space between tissue and bone. Ryota was 2 tables away, in conversation with the council's senior representative, when Elena saw Kenji Mori cross the room toward her. She did not move. She did not look for Ryota. She simply waited, with the stillness of someone who has been expecting something for a long time and is now watching it arrive. He stopped in front of her. His expression was entirely neutral, not cold, not warm, present. "You're Elena Vasquez," he said. It was not a question. "I am," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way that some people use silence, not as absence of speech, but as a kind of statement. Then he said very quietly, "I think there are things you already know that you haven't yet decided what to do with." She held his gaze. "I think most people in this room would say the same. Not the way you know them," he said. And then, before she could respond, he inclined his head slightly, that same nod, the one from Kyoto, and moved away. She stood in the center of that conversation for the next 4 minutes, completely still on the outside, entirely in motion internally, because he was right. She did know things. She had known them for 7 weeks. Here is what Elena Vasquez had discovered. 49 days before the coalition dinner, in the process of conducting a routine compliance review of Shindo Industries' documentation for a new Northern Logistics Agreement, she had found an anomaly, not a large one, not the kind that announces itself, the kind that hides in plain sight inside a sub-clause of a sub-agreement buried in a package of 47 contracts that no one was expected to read in full. She had read it in full. She always did. The anomaly was a clause that, when cross-referenced with 3 other documents she had been granted access to as part of her clearance, revealed something that reframed the entire conflict between Ryota Shindo and Kenji Mori, not in the way she had understood it. Not the story of 2 rivals occupying competing territory. Something older, something that had been set in motion before she ever entered this world. 7 years ago, Kenji Mori had not taken those port logistics operations from Ryota Shindo. He had been given them, quietly, conditionally, through an intermediary structure that no longer legally existed. The arrangement had been designed to look like a hostile acquisition from the outside, because that was precisely what it needed to look like. Because the arrangement was protection. For Ryota, specifically, from a council investigation into financial conduct that, if it had proceeded, would have ended Shindo Industries entirely. Mori had taken the asset. He had absorbed the appearance of being the aggressor. He had let 7 years of public hostility accumulate between them. The whispered history, the industry gossip, the carefully maintained narrative of rivalry, because that narrative was the cover story for a debt that had never been repaid and was never supposed to be visible. And now the new Northern Logistics Agreement that Eleanor had been asked to review was, in the language of the subclause she had found, a mechanism designed to absorb those port operations back into Shindo Industries at a fraction of their current value. Without acknowledgement, without resolution, without repayment. It was, in the precise forensic language of her profession, a structured extraction, and Ryota Shindo had authorized every layer of it. She had sat with this for 49 days. She had not filed her review. She had not raised a flag. She had not spoken to Ryota. She had not told anyone. She had simply continued working, continued being present, continued being the person everyone trusted, while she made the most difficult calculation of her professional life. The question was not what was right. She knew what was right. The question was what kind of person she was going to be when she answered it. Now you understand what she was holding when Kenji Mori crossed that room, and you understand what that nod meant in Kyoto. He knew she had access to the documents. He had known for some time that if anyone in Ryota's orbit was going to find what he had hidden in plain sight as a failsafe, a record, his own protection against the extraction, it was the forensic risk analyst with the clearance level that shouldn't have existed. He had not planted the information. He had simply not removed it. And he had waited. What you're about to understand is why Elena's choice, the moment she crossed that ballroom and stood beside Kenji Mori in front of every person who mattered, was not a betrayal. It was a conclusion. The dinner moved into its formal phase. Presentations, numbers, projections presented with the particular smoothness of people who are very good at making optimism sound like fact. Elena sat at her assigned table, 3 seats from Ryota, and she ate almost nothing, and she listened to everything, and somewhere between the second course and the end of the remarks from the council's northern representative, she made her decision. She stood up. It was not an aggressive movement. It was simply a woman standing in a room where people were seated, which is the kind of movement that draws immediate attention precisely because of its quietness. Ryota noticed. Several council members noticed. The room shifted its focus without fully understanding why. She walked across the floor, not quickly, not dramatically, in the same way she moved through every boardroom she had ever entered, with the specific gravity of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has already done the thinking. She stopped beside Kenji Mori. He looked at her, not with surprise, with something that was closer to recognition. She said, at a volume that required no projection, but carried cleanly in the particular acoustics of the Hana Pavilion, I need you to authorize the release of the 47 documents, all of them, tonight. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Ryota Shindo set down his glass. She did not look at him, not yet. Mori looked at her for 3 seconds. Then he said, do you understand what you're asking? Yes, she said. I'm asking you to end this correctly. And here is where the story reaches the moment the title promised. Because Kenji Mori did not say yes. He did not say no. He reached inside his jacket and he placed a slim envelope on the table in front of Elena. And he said, in a voice the entire nearest section of the room could hear clearly, I've been waiting for someone from his side to find enough of their own conscience to ask that question. I'd given up hoping. He looked past her then, directly at Ryota Shindo. It's already done, he said. The documents have been filed with the council as of this morning. Everything. The original arrangement, the debt structure, the extraction clause, all of it. The room did not erupt. Rooms like this one do not erupt. They freeze. And in that freeze, in that absolute suspension of social performance, Kenji Mori turned to the senior council representative at the adjacent table and said, you'll have the formal notification in your office when you return. I believe a review is now appropriate. Ryota Shindo stood. His chair made a sound against the floor that was the loudest thing in the room. He looked at Elena. She finally looked back at him. This is the moment that this story has been building toward. Not the confrontation, not the documents, not the council. This moment, 2 people looking at each other across a room full of witnesses, and only one of them holding the truth about what had just happened. Because what Ryota saw on Elena's face was not anger. It was not triumph. It was grief. Clean, specific, unperformative grief. The kind that comes from watching something you cared about reveal itself as something you cannot protect. She had not done this to destroy him. She had done this because 49 days of carrying the weight of what she knew had taught her one thing with absolute clarity. The cover story had become the prison. Mori had spent 7 years absorbing hostility he did not earn, protecting a man who had repaid that protection with a structured theft disguised as a business transaction. And Elena had been unknowingly positioned as the tool that would make that theft operationally invisible. She had refused to be the tool. That was all. That was the whole of it. Ryota did not speak. He looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man standing in a room that has just shifted its walls. Then he looked at Mori, then at the council representative, then back at Elena. He said very quietly, "How long have you known?" 49 days, she said. He absorbed that. The arithmetic of it, the fact that she had sat beside him, worked with him, continued every normal rhythm of their professional life for 49 days without a word. Not out of deception, out of the specific seriousness of someone making sure they were right before they acted. "Why didn't you come to me?" he said. It was not fully a question. "Because coming to you with this would have given you the option to remove it," she said. "And the only thing worse than the original arrangement would have been a second one to bury the first." The council representative stood. 2 of the other senior figures at his table followed. The formal machinery of consequence was beginning to move, slowly and without drama, the way it does when it has been given no choice. Ryota Shindo sat back down. He did not look defeated exactly. He looked like a man who had just been handed the correct bill for a meal he had spent 7 years pretending he'd already paid. What happened in the weeks following the coalition dinner is the part of the story that was never fully public, which is both the nature of these worlds and the reason why stories like this one exist, to carry what the official record does not. The council review was thorough. The documentation Mori had submitted was complete. The original arrangement, the one from 7 years ago, the asset transfer in exchange for the protection of Ryota's position during the investigation, was verified, acknowledged, and entered into the formal record of the coalition's governance structure for the first time. The Northern Logistics Agreement was suspended pending review. The extraction clause was voided. The port operations held by Mori remained where they were, which was where they had been for 7 years, which was where they had been placed by an agreement that finally, at last, existed in the light. Ryota Shindo was not removed from his position. The original conduct that had necessitated the arrangement 7 years ago fell outside the current statute of limitations, and the council's interest was in resolution rather than punishment. But he was placed under a formal advisory period. His signature alone was no longer sufficient for contracts above a certain value. The quiet authority he had moved through the world with for 3 decades was now subject to a second set of eyes. He accepted it. That was the thing that surprised the people close to him most. He accepted it without contest, without appeal, without the deployment of the considerable legal resources available to him. He simply accepted it. The people who had known him long enough to understand what that meant said it was the first genuinely honest thing they had seen him do in years. Elena resigned her consulting contract the morning after the dinner. She did not send a letter with reasons. She simply sent her final invoice, marked the file closed, and did not return calls for 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, she was alone in the apartment she kept in Kyoto. She had always preferred Kyoto to Osaka, something she had never explained to Ryota, and he had never asked. And she did what people do after they have made a decision that cost them something real. She was very quiet. She read. She walked by the river in the early mornings when no one else was there. She did not perform recovery. She simply let the days move through her until they felt like days again, instead of like wait. On the 17th day, she received a message from Kenji Mori. It was brief. It said, "The council has confirmed the review is complete. I thought you should know before the public statement." She replied with 2 words. "Thank you," he replied with 1. "Likewise." That was the entirety of it. No offer, no proposition, no beginning of something else dressed as acknowledgement. Just 2 people who had, through their separate commitments to accuracy, arrived at the same necessary conclusion, and who had the discipline to let that be enough. On the 23rd day, Ryota Shindo came to Kyoto. She did not know he was coming. He did not ask if he could. He simply appeared at the door of her building at 7 in the morning, and she opened it, and they stood in the doorway for a moment before she stepped aside to let him in. He did not sit. He stood in her small kitchen with his hands in his pockets and looked at the river visible through her window, and he said, "I spent a long time believing that the thing I did 7 years ago was survivable because no one ever had to know about it fully, including me." She poured water into the kettle. She did not prompt him. "I told myself that the arrangement was a necessity," he said. "That keeping the company alive, keeping everyone who depended on it in employment, keeping the structure intact, that it justified it, that Kenji understood this, that it was a transaction between equals who both knew what it was. He paused. But it wasn't a transaction. It was a debt I never intended to pay. And I hired you, brought you that deep into things, genuinely believing that your competence would serve the company. And it did. It just also found the one thing I was counting on staying buried. I know, she said. That's not an apology, he said. I'm not certain I've earned the right to offer one yet. No, she agreed. You haven't. He was quiet for a while. The kettle began to heat. Outside the window, the river was silver in the early light, moving without urgency. What will you do now? He asked. Work, she said. Probably somewhere that doesn't require me to carry someone else's risk profile for 3 years before I understand what I've actually been hired to protect. He absorbed that. It was not a rebuke dressed as a plan. It was simply accurate. He left 20 minutes later. He did not ask her for anything. He did not suggest a future. He shook her hand at the door, formally, the way he had the first time they met, when she had delivered a 48-minute audit and left without asking for praise, and he walked down the stairs and into the street. She watched him go. Then she turned back to her kitchen, poured her tea, and sat by the window and watched the river, and let the silence be the silence it was, not an absence but a completion. Before we reach the end of this story, if this is the kind of storytelling you come back for, the kind that takes its time and means what it says, please subscribe right now. There are more stories here that deserve an audience, and yours matters. Hit that bell. Be here for the next one. What Kenji Mori had understood, and what Elena had arrived at through 49 days of careful solitude with the truth, was something that the ballroom full of witnesses at the Hana Pavilion had seen but not fully comprehended in the moment. The choice she made was not the choice they thought they were watching. They thought they were watching a woman cross the floor to stand beside the enemy of the man she worked for. They thought it was ambition, or leverage, or a negotiation happening in real time through the symbolic language of physical position. They thought it was the kind of move that people in those rooms sometimes make, the dramatic pivot, the sudden alliance, the social statement that reshapes a room's geometry in one gesture. They were wrong. She had crossed the floor to stand beside Kenji Mori, not as an ally. She had stood beside him as the only person in that room willing to ask him directly, in front of everyone, to do what she had calculated he was already prepared to do. She had made herself visible so that he could act without the appearance of unilateral aggression. She had given the moment a witness who was trusted by both sides, which was the only kind of witness that could make the act mean what it needed to mean. She had not chosen his enemy. She had chosen the truth. And she had placed herself beside the person most likely to deliver it, because she was the one person in the room who understood with forensic precision that the delivery was the most dangerous part. The cost of that understanding was everything she had built in 3 years inside Shindo Industries. The relationships, the access, the particular intimacy of being the person a powerful man trusts with his most sensitive numbers. All of it had ended the moment she stood up from that table. She had known it would. She had stood up anyway. This is not a story about a woman who chose correctly and was rewarded for it. That is not how these stories work in the world that Elena Vasquez occupied. The world of old industrial families and council governance and arrangements that live in subtext for decades before anyone forces them into language. It is a story about what it costs to be the kind of person who cannot falsify a report, who cannot close a file they have opened, who cannot look at an anomaly and decide for the sake of comfort that it was not anomalous. There is a particular loneliness to that kind of integrity, especially when it operates inside systems that reward its opposite. Eleanor carried that loneliness. She had always carried it. It was the thing that made her excellent at her work and difficult to keep close, and she had made a certain quiet peace with the arithmetic of that long before Ryota Shindo's name appeared in her professional life. What changed in the weeks after Kyoto was not the loneliness. It was what she did with it. She took a new contract, a smaller firm this time, not one of the large structures with the complex layered relationships and the clearance levels and the 47 contract packages. A maritime insurance company out of Kobe needed someone to build their risk documentation framework from the ground up. It was detailed, careful work with no political dimension and no personal entanglement. It was, in the specific language of her professional desire, clean. She moved to Kobe. She found an apartment near the water. She started very early every morning and finished at a reasonable hour and spent her evenings doing nothing in particular. Reading, walking, cooking meals she had never had time to learn properly before this. She did not think often about the coalition dinner. When she did, She thought less about the moment she stood up and more about the moment Ryota asked her how long she had known. 49 days, she had said, and the way he had received that, not with anger, but with the specific weight of a man understanding for the first time the full dimension of what he had built around himself and what it had required of someone else to carry. That was the moment she returned to, not with regret, with something more like recognition. Because the truth about Ryota Shindo was not that he was a villain. The truth was more complicated and less satisfying than that. He was a man who had made a choice under pressure many years ago and had then spent the intervening time constructing elaborate reasons why the choice had been necessary until the narrative had become the reality he operated in, until the debt felt like a transaction, until Kenji Mori's silence felt like acceptance rather than waiting. Most people are not destroyed by their worst impulses. They are eroded by the small daily practice of convincing themselves that their worst impulses were something else. Elena had seen this pattern in financial documents her entire career. She was very good at recognizing it in people now, too. And Kenji Mori, the man the room had called the enemy, the man who had spent 7 years wearing the identity of aggressor, had turned out to be, in his specific way, something the word enemy does not contain. He had been a creditor, a patient one, with a very long memory, and a very precise sense of what restitution actually required. Not the assets, not the money, the acknowledgement, the official record, the truth in the light where it could not be reversed. He had waited 7 years for someone from the other side to find it for themselves, and Elena Vasquez had been the someone. She thought about that sometimes too, the specific strangeness of being the instrument of a resolution you did not know you were participating in until you were already in the middle of it. She had gone into those documents looking for routine compliance anomalies. She had found the fault line at the center of two men's relationship, and by finding it, she had become part of the story herself. She was not certain she minded that. She had minded many things in her life, but she had a quality that was perhaps her most defining characteristic, more than her precision, more than her competence, more than her willingness to stand in a ballroom and make herself the visible instrument of an uncomfortable truth. She was not sentimental about outcomes. She wanted the accurate picture. Once she had it, she could work with whatever it showed. The picture she had now in Kobe, in the apartment near the water, in the careful, satisfying work of the maritime firm, was an accurate one. Not complete. No picture ever is, but honest in its proportions and hers in the specific way that things you have paid for honestly are yours. That was enough. She had learned slowly that enough was not a defeat. It was the only honest victory available to people who refused to lie about what they were counting. Outside the window of her Kobe apartment, the port moved in its rhythms, ships arriving, ships departing, cargo transferred from one category to another, logged and verified and released. The whole massive system of things moving through the world, being received and accounted for and sent forward. She watched it sometimes in the evenings and felt something she did not have an immediate word for. It was not peace exactly, because peace implies the end of something. It was more like alignment, the sensation of existing in the same register as the work she was doing, the world she was in, the person she had decided to be and kept being, even when it was expensive. That sensation, quiet and private and requiring no witness, was the payoff. Not the ballroom, not the council review, not even the morning Ryota Shindo appeared at her door and told her, in his oblique and formal way, that she had been right. This specific, unphotographable feeling of a life that had not been falsified. Elena Vasquez had chosen his enemy. That is what the room saw. That is what will always be the version that survives in the social memory of that evening in Osaka. The woman who walked across the floor and stood beside the man everyone called a rival, and the explosion of truth that followed. But the truth about the truth is always smaller and quieter than its consequences. It is a woman in a Kyoto apartment, on day 49, closing a document and understanding that she cannot not act. It is the decision made alone, without applause, without an audience, in the specific loneliness of knowing something that has to be known. That is where the real choice was made. Everything that followed, the ballroom, the witnesses, the council, the public exposure, was just the consequence of one woman refusing to be the instrument of a lie she had been asked to carry without knowing she was carrying it. She chose the truth, in private, before anyone was watching. And then she walked into the room and let the room see what that looked like. That is a different story than the one the title tells, but it is the true one. And the true one is always the more interesting one if you're willing to stay long enough to find it. Thank you for being here through the full length of this one. These stories exist because you watch them, because you share them, because you stay when it would be easier to move on to something louder and faster. If this one moved you, if Elena's story landed somewhere real, leave a comment and tell us what you felt in the moment she walked across that floor. Was she right? Was there another way? The conversation in the comments is always worth reading. Subscribe if you haven't. The next story is already waiting, and it will not be anything like this one.